At some point, almost without noticing it, the way you think about money begins to reorganize itself. And for many people, that shift emerges around the first five-figure threshold, not because $10,000 is inherently transformative in isolation, but because it changes the structure of how decisions are made, moving money out of a purely reactive role and into something that begins to resemble controlled optionality, where time, risk, and choice are no longer tightly compressed into the present moment, and where the pressure of immediacy begins, even slightly, to loosen its grip on how you interpret every financial decision. When money is near zero, financial life is governed by immediacy, where every expense is not just a number, but a disruption, and every decision is constrained by what cannot be delayed, which creates a feedback loop where short-term thinking is not a flaw but a requirement. And under those conditions, even rational people behave in ways that appear inconsistent over time, not because they lack discipline, but because the system they are operating in rewards urgency over optimization, and over time, this repeated exposure to urgency begins to shape identity itself, reinforcing the idea that money is something that arrives and leaves quickly, rather than something that can be directed with intention. But once a buffer like $10,000 exists, even if it is modest relative to long-term goals, it introduces something subtle but structurally important, which is temporal distance, meaning this pattern is not new, and it is not culturally specific, because if you look across different economic periods, whether it is workers during the late stages of the Industrial Revolution gradually accumulating small reserves, or households in the decades following World War II building their first savings buffers, there is always a point where money stops being purely defensive and begins to support strategy. And while the number changes with inflation and geography, the underlying shift remains consistent, repeating itself across different systems, currencies, and generations. At zero, money functions as a stabilizer for survival, but at 10,000, it begins to function as a decision-making tool, and this distinction, while easy to overlook, is where compounding begins in a broader sense, not just in terms of returns, but in terms of behavior, because behavior is the mechanism through which financial outcomes are ultimately produced. And once behavior begins to change, even slightly, the trajectory begins to diverge over time. The psychological layer of this shift is tied closely to how humans perceive risk under constraint, because when resources are limited, risk is not evaluated abstractly. It is experienced as potential loss of stability, which makes avoidance the dominant strategy. But when a buffer exists, risk becomes something that can be measured, compared, and occasionally accepted. And this reframing changes not just people begin to tolerate uncertainty with less emotional volatility. They negotiate from a slightly stronger position because the cost of walking away is no longer immediate collapse, and they start to think in longer timelines, not because they suddenly become more patient, but because patience becomes structurally possible. And when patience becomes possible, entirely new categories of decisions become available, including those that require waiting, evaluation, and delayed outcomes. To understand why this matters beyond psychology, it helps to look at the underlying math, because the mechanics of money behave very differently depending on whether you are above or below this threshold, and the difference is not always visible in income, but in how external shocks are absorbed and how time interacts with those shocks. When you operate at or near zero, any unexpected expense, whether it is medical, mechanical, or environmental, forces a negative financial reaction, typically in the form of debt, and debt introduces interest, which is not just a cost, but a compounding force that moves in the opposite direction of wealth accumulation, effectively pulling future income backward into the past. And over time, this creates a situation where a portion of your future effort is already committed to resolving past disruptions. But when a $10,000 buffer exists, that same unexpected expense is absorbed internally, which means the system avoids entering a negative compounding cycle, and this difference, repeated over time, creates a widening gap between two otherwise similar financial trajectories, not because one person is earning dramatically more, but because one is avoiding structural drag while the other is repeatedly exposed. To make this more concrete, consider a simple scenario where an unexpected expense of $1,000 occurs once per year, and one individual must finance that expense at a 20% annual interest rate, while another absorbs it from savings. Over a 5-year period, the individual relying on debt is not just paying $5,000 in principal, but also accumulating interest that compounds each year, pushing the total cost significantly higher, while the individual with a buffer pays only the original cost, preserving both capital and time. Extend that scenario to 10 years, and the divergence becomes more pronounced because the individual using debt is not only paying for repeated expenses, but also for the time value of money lost to interest, while the individual with savings retains that time value. And this difference compounds quietly, often without being immediately visible, but increasingly impactful as time progresses. What is often overlooked is that avoiding high-interest debt is mathematically similar to earning a guaranteed return, sometimes equivalent to double-digit percentages, which in many cases exceeds what traditional investments can reliably produce. And yet this return is rarely perceived as such because it is invisible. It shows up as an absence of loss rather than a visible gain, which makes it psychologically undervalued despite its structural importance. Beyond absorption of shocks, the second mathematical layer introduced at this threshold is optionality, and optionality is best understood as the ability to delay irreversible decisions. Because many financial mistakes are not costly simply because they are wrong, but because they cannot be undone, and when decisions are made under pressure, the likelihood of irreversibility increases. With a buffer, decisions gain reversibility. You can wait before accepting an offer. You can exit a situation that is financially misaligned. You can pause instead of committing under pressure. And while each of these choices may seem small in isolation, they reduce the probability of compounding negative outcomes, which is one of the most underappreciated aspects of financial stability. Because avoiding irreversible mistakes is often more impactful than capturing optimal opportunities. There is also a timing advantage embedded here, because financial opportunities, whether in work, investment, or skill development, often require a window of participation, and without a buffer, that window may be inaccessible simply due to timing constraints. But with even a modest reserve, the ability to engage with opportunities becomes more flexible, not guaranteed, but possible. Historically, this is visible in how early-stage savers begin to separate from purely wage-dependent cycles, not by dramatically increasing income, but by reducing the frequency of destabilizing events. And over long time horizons, stability itself becomes a form of advantage because it allows compounding, both financial and behavioral, to operate without interruption, which is essential for long-term growth. However, it is important to remove a common misunderstanding, which is that $10,000 represents security or wealth, because it does not. It does not eliminate risk, it does not create passive income, and it does not guarantee upward mobility. What it does is shift the system from reactive to slightly proactive, which is a very different condition, but still far from financial independence. And recognizing this distinction prevents overconfidence while still acknowledging the significance of the shift. Below this threshold, the system is dominated by external forces. Income timing, expense volatility, and unforeseen disruptions dictate outcomes. But above it, internal decisions begin to carry more weight, not because the environment becomes easier, but because the individual has gained a small but meaningful degree of control over timing and response, which changes how often they are forced into disadvantageous situations. And this is where identity begins to change in a way that is often subtle but deeply consequential. Because financial behavior is not driven solely by knowledge or intention, it is heavily influenced by self-perception. And once someone begins to see themselves as a person who has margin, who can absorb shocks, who is not operating at the edge of constraint, their behavior gradually aligns with that identity, reinforcing the very conditions that created it. They begin to track money not out of urgency, but out of awareness. They plan not just for the next expense, but for the next phase, and they engage with money as a system that can be shaped rather than a sequence of events that must be endured. And over time, this shift in engagement leads to more consistent, less reactive financial patterns. This identity shift does not happen all at once, and it is not always visible externally, but it changes the default setting from reaction to consideration, and over time, that change influences hundreds of decisions that compound into larger outcomes, creating a divergence that is difficult to attribute to any single moment, but clear when viewed across years. From a systemic perspective, This is why small differences in early financial thresholds can lead to large divergences later, because the system itself has not changed, the rules remain the same. But the position within the system has shifted, and that position determines how often you are forced into disadvantageous decisions and how often you are able to avoid them. Two individuals with similar incomes can experience entirely different financial paths over a decade, not because one had access to extraordinary opportunities, but because one spent more time operating above this threshold, where decisions could be delayed, evaluated, and optimized, even slightly, while the other remained in a system dominated by immediacy and constraint. And over long periods, slight optimization consistently applied tends to outperform reactive decision-making, even when the difference in each individual moment is small, because consistency compounds, while reaction tends to reset progress repeatedly. There is also an emotional dimension to this shift that is rarely discussed, which is the reduction of cognitive load, because operating without a buffer requires constant attention to financial detail. Every expense must be monitored, every fluctuation matters, and this sustained attention consumes mental bandwidth that could otherwise be used for planning, learning, or strategic thinking. When a buffer exists, even a modest one, some of that cognitive load is reduced, not eliminated, but softened, and this creates space for higher-level thinking, which in turn supports better decision-making, creating a feedback loop where improved cognition leads to improved outcomes, which reinforces the buffer itself. Over time, this feedback loop becomes one of the most powerful yet invisible advantages of crossing this threshold, because it operates quietly, without dramatic changes, but with consistent influence on behavior and decision quality. This is ultimately what $10,000 represents, not a destination, but a transition point, a movement from fragility toward early-stage stability, from immediacy toward limited foresight, from constraint toward initial optionality. And while it is easy to underestimate because it does not look like wealth, it is one of the first moments where money begins to influence not just outcomes, but cognition itself. And once cognition changes, behavior follows. And once behavior changes, the trajectory begins to shift, often quietly, often slowly, but in ways that compound over time into something that, in hindsight, appears far more significant than the number itself ever suggested. Because the real change was never the money alone, but the system of thinking that emerged